Hey, I'm Vesper, and I am 28 years old. My father-in-law, Theron, was the only real family I had left after my own parents passed away. He possessed this booming, infectious laugh that would rattle the fine china in Morwenna's disgustingly pristine dining room. Morwenna is my mother-in-law. Calling her cold would be a massive understatement. She treated affection like a currency she refused to spend. When Kaylin and I got married, Theron welcomed me with wide arms and terrible dad jokes. Morwenna handed me a prenuptial agreement on a silver tray. Theron built a massive real estate portfolio from the ground up, but the wealth never changed him. He still wore cheap flannel shirts and insisted on fixing his own plumbing. Kaylin idolized him. I adored him. We lived in the guest house on their sprawling estate because Theron wanted us close, especially since Kaylin traveled frequently for his geological surveys. Morwenna hated our proximity. She watched my every move from her sunroom window, her eyes tracking me like a hawk hunting a field mouse. Then Theron got sick. It started as a persistent cough and escalated into severe respiratory failure within months. The doctors were baffled by how rapidly he deteriorated. Morwenna immediately barred us from hiring outside nurses, insisting she would handle his care personally. She locked the master suite doors, claiming he needed absolute peace. I should have kicked those heavy oak doors down. Theron died on a rainy Tuesday, while Kaylin was stuck on a drilling rig in the North Sea. I sat alone in the hospital waiting room, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor, trying to process the doctor's flat tone. Morwenna didn't even cry. She stood near the vending machines, briskly typing on her phone, her posture rigid and businesslike. She looked more annoyed by the inconvenience than devastated by the loss of her husband of 40 years. When Kaylin finally made it back for the funeral, he was a ghost of himself. He barely spoke, just stared blankly at the mahogany casket. I held his hand tightly, wanting to offer comfort, but carrying a secret that felt incredibly heavy under the circumstances. I was pregnant. I had taken the test the morning Theron was rushed to the ER. I planned to tell Kaylin over dinner, hoping the news would bring some joy to a miserable week. Instead, the reading of the will shattered our reality. We gathered in the excessively lavish office of Morwenna's personal attorney, a man named Sterling who refused to meet my gaze. Kaylin sat beside me, looking numb. Morwenna wore a sharp black suit and a completely unreadable expression. Sterling cleared his throat, adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, and began reading the document. I expected standard legal jargon. I did not expect to hear that Darren had completely cut us out of everything. According to the document, Sterling read aloud, Theron left the entire estate, the company, and all liquid assets exclusively to Morwenna. Kaylin received nothing. I received a single insulting mention, stating I was a financial liability. The wording didn't sound like Theron at all. He always spoke about building a legacy for his future grandchildren. He promised Kaylin the reins of the real estate empire by his 30th birthday. Now, this piece of paper painted a picture of a bitter, distrustful old man. Kaylin asked to see the document. He traced his father's signature at the bottom of the page, his brow furrowing. "This doesn't look right," he muttered, his voice cracking. Morwenna snatched the paper back immediately, glaring at her son. She claimed Theron's hand was shaking terribly in his final days. She said he realized Kaylin was too naive to manage the fortune, and decided she was the only capable steward. I sat there frozen, my hand resting defensively over my stomach. We lived in the guest house. We depended on a modest stipend from the company while Kaylin finished his advanced degree, a setup Theron explicitly arranged. If Morwenna controlled everything, we were utterly at her mercy, and she possessed zero mercy. As we left the office, Morwenna cornered me in the hallway. She leaned in close, smelling of expensive gin and mint mints, and whispered that we had until the end of the week to vacate her property. Packing our lives into cardboard boxes while dealing with morning sickness was a nightmare I cannot properly describe. Kaylin spiraled into a deep depression, convinced his father hated him in the end. He spent hours staring at the wall, ignoring his phone, skipping his classes. We moved into a cramped, noisy motel room on the edge of town because we literally had nowhere else to go. The savings account held barely enough to cover a month's rent and food. I refused to believe Theron wrote that will. He loved us. He was ecstatic when I mentioned we were trying for a baby months ago. He even started sketching ideas for a nursery remodel in the guest house. Why would a man actively planning for his grandchild suddenly write a document calling me a liability? It made zero sense. I needed proof. I needed answers. Theron kept digital backups of his personal files on a private cloud server. Kaylin set it up for him years ago and knew the administrative passwords, though he was currently too numb to care about them. I logged in late one night while Kaylin slept off another day of misery. I bypassed the standard folders and headed straight for the raw security logs from the main house. Morwenna always bragged about her state-of-the-art smart home system. She forgot that the system recorded everything, including the temperature settings and medical equipment data in the master suite. I spent 3 days staring at endless lines of server data, drinking cheap instant coffee to stay awake. I cross-referenced the smart home logs with the medical notes Morwenna gave the doctors. The doctors believed Theron suffered a sudden, unavoidable decline. The data told a horrifyingly different story. Theron required a specific oxygen concentration from his CPAP machine to maintain his lung function. According to the machine's internal telemetry logs, someone manually lowered the oxygen output every night at exactly 2 a.m. Morwenna claimed she barely slept, vigilantly monitoring him. The motion sensors in the hallway proved she actually slept in the guest room across the hall, never checking on him once between midnight and sunrise. Worse, the logs showed the smart thermostat in the master suite routinely dropped to near freezing temperatures during the night, putting intense stress on his already failing respiratory system. She deliberately accelerated his death. My hands shook violently as I exported the data files to an encrypted hard drive. She murdered the only father figure I ever had, forged a will, and threw her pregnant daughter-in-law into the street. A cold, furious clarity replaced my grief. I looked over at my sleeping husband, knowing I had to destroy his mother completely. I was not just going to take our money back. I was going to ruin her life. The raw data from the thermostat and oxygen machine painted a sinister picture, but it remained circumstantial. Any decent defense attorney could argue the equipment malfunctioned or the network glitched. I needed undeniable, concrete proof connecting Morwenna to the altered will. That meant getting back into the main house. The sheer thought of stepping onto that estate made my stomach churn, but anger easily overpowered my nausea. Kaylin remained catatonic, completely oblivious to my late-night hacking sessions. I decided to leave him out of it for now. Knowing his mother killed his father would break whatever fragile pieces of his sanity remained. I waited until Tuesday afternoon, the exact time where Morwenna always attended her pretentious country club luncheons. She adhered to her social schedule with religious fanaticism, leaving the sprawling mansion entirely empty for exactly 3 hours. I borrowed Kaylin's old set of emergency keys, praying she hadn't changed the locks on the heavy mahogany side door. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slipped through the garden, avoiding the main security cameras. I knew the blind spots intimately because Theron and I mapped them out years ago when we set up the system together. Turning the brass key felt like pulling the pin on a grenade. The lock clicked, yielding to my push, and I slipped inside the silent, oppressive house. The air inside the house felt suffocating, thick with the scent of lavender polish and old deceit. I crept past the grand staircase and headed straight for Theron's home office. Morwenna had already redecorated, stripping away his comfortable leather armchair and replacing it with sterile modern art. She kept his desktop computer, though. She was profoundly incompetent with technology, assuming her simple login password protected everything. I slid into the desk chair, waking the monitor. Her password was literally her own birth year. I bypassed the standard documents and dug straight into the hidden temporary files on the hard drive. Forensic accounting was my actual profession before I married Kaylin, and recovering deleted data was practically my party trick. Within 20 minutes, I hit a gold mine. Morwenna had hired an online service to practice forging Theron's signature, scanning multiple attempts into the computer before deleting them. She missed the cache files. I downloaded every single high-resolution image of her clumsy, shaky practice signatures onto my flash drive. Then I found an email draft addressed to Sterling, the slimy estate lawyer. The text outlined a massive transfer of Theron's liquid assets to a private offshore account, bypassing the estate taxes entirely. She was liquidating the empire and hiding the cash. My pulse roared in my ears.
I copied the email thread, ensuring the metadata remained completely intact.
A sudden scrape of tires on the gravel driveway froze the blood in my veins. I glanced out the window and saw Morwenna's silver sedan idling near the fountain. She was home an hour early. Panic spiked hard in my chest, threatening to trigger a wave of morning sickness right there on the Persian rug. I yanked the flash drive from the computer tower, smoothed the desk chair back to its exact angle, and sprinted silently toward the rear servant stairs. I heard her high heels clicking sharply against the marble foyer as I slipped through the kitchen and out the back door. I collapsed against the cold stone of the garden wall, gasping for air, clutching the plastic flash drive like a lifeline. I had the weapon. Now I needed the absolute perfect moment to strike. Going to the police immediately would only trigger a lengthy legal battle. Sterling would drag it out for years, exhausting our non-existent funds while Morwenna lived in luxury. I wanted immediate, total destruction. I wanted her to feel the exact panic and helplessness she forced onto Kaylin and me. I spent the next 2 weeks meticulously organizing the data. I built a comprehensive timeline showing the oxygen drops, the temperature manipulation, the signature practice sessions, and the offshore transfer requests. I was constructing an inescapable trap.
I told Kaylin I secured a meeting with Sterling to discuss returning some of Theron's personal effects. He just nodded blankly, too exhausted to argue. I actually emailed Sterling directly, hinting that I possessed hard copies of Theron's original financial ledgers and was willing to surrender them for a small one-time cash settlement to pay our medical bills. The bait worked flawlessly. Greed always makes people sloppy. Sterling agreed to host the meeting at his downtown law firm, confirming Morwenna would be present to authorize the payout. I wore my cheapest maternity dress, playing the part of the defeated, desperate daughter-in-law to perfection. When Kaylin and I walked into the plush conference room, Morwenna sat at the head of the long glass table, sipping sparkling water with an expression of profound boredom. Sterling gave me a patronizing smile, sliding a manila folder containing a non-disclosure agreement across the glass. They expected me to sign away my rights for a few $1,000s. Kaylin refused to look at his mother, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I ignored the folder entirely. Instead, I pulled a sleek silver laptop from my bag and connected it to the large presentation monitor mounted on the wall. Sterling frowned, his patronizing smile slipping. I typed in my decryption password, pulled up the first slide of my presentation, and looked Morwenna dead in the eye.
"I am not here for a settlement," I said, my voice steady and icy. "I am here to show you a story." I pressed a button, and the screen flashed to life. The first image was a side-by-side comparison. On the left, Theron's actual verified signature from our marriage certificate. On the right, the signature from the fraudulent will. Below them, I displayed the 6 deleted practice scans I recovered from Morwenna's hard drive. Sterling literally choked on his breath, his face drained of all color as he recognized the clear progression of forged attempts. Morwenna dropped her glass. It shattered against the table, spilling sparkling water across the mahogany surface. "What is this nonsense?" she hissed, trying to project authority while her hands visibly trembled. "You photoshopped this." I ignored her outburst and clicked to the next slide. This one displayed the raw metadata from her computer, showing the exact timestamps the images were created, alongside the login credentials tied directly to her personal user account. I watched the realization dawn on Kaylin's face next to me. He sat up straight, his eyes darting between the screen and his mother. The fog of his depression broke, replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity. "Vesper," Kaylin whispered, his voice thick with rising anger. "What did she do?" I didn't answer him. I just brought up the smart home telemetry logs.
I clicked the remote, bringing up the graphs I had painstakingly built from the smart home telemetry. A red line tracked the temperature in the master suite. A blue line tracked the oxygen output of Theron's CPAP machine. "This is the final week of Theron's life," I explained, keeping my tone deadly calm. "Notice the sudden drops at exactly 2 a.m. every night. The room temperature plummets. The oxygen levels cut in half." Sterling started aggressively shuffling his papers, sweating profusely through his expensive silk suit. "These are unverified electronic records, completely inadmissible without expert testimony." "Oh, I am a forensic accountant, Sterling. I am the expert," I snapped back. "And the motion sensors show Morwenna sleeping soundly in the guest room during every single one of these medical crises." Kalen stood up so fast his chair crashed backward into the wall. He stared at his mother, his chest heaving as the truth finally clicked into place. "You froze him?" Kalen choked out, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "He was struggling to breathe, and you turned down his oxygen?" Morwenna stood up, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She is lying. She fabricated all of this because I kicked her out." I simply clicked to the next slide, displaying the email draft addressed to Sterling outlining the illegal offshore transfers. Sterling let out a pathetic squeak. The walls were rapidly closing in on them.
"Here is what happens next," I said, slamming my laptop shut. The loud crack echoed off the glass walls. "I have already sent a scheduled email containing this entire presentation, along with the raw data files, to the district attorney's office. It sends automatically in exactly 1 hour if I do not cancel it." Morwenna glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Her polished facade had completely crumbled, leaving a desperate, cornered animal in its place. "What do you want, Vesper? Name your price. 5 million? 10? I laughed. A bitter, jagged sound tore from my throat. "You think I want your dirty money? You think I want my child to inherit a fortune built on their grandfather's murder?" Kalen walked over and grabbed my hand. His grip felt solid, anchoring me to reality. He finally saw his mother for the monster she truly was. "We are liquidating everything," I demanded. "The estate, the stock portfolios, the shell companies, and the offshore accounts. All of it." "You cannot do that," Sterling stammered, pulling at his collar. "The legal hurdles alone." "You will find a way," I interrupted, staring him down. "Because if you don't, I will gladly watch you lose your license and go to federal prison for conspiring to commit massive estate fraud. You have 48 hours to draft the transfer documents." Morwenna crossed her arms defensively. "Transfer to whom?" "The Evergreen Wildlife Trust," I replied with a smirk. The Evergreen Wildlife Trust was a massive conservation organization dedicated to purchasing private land and turning it into protected nature reserves. Morwenna absolutely loathed them. For 10 years, she had fought tooth and nail to secure a massive development permit on the edge of town, planning to bulldoze a protected wetlands area to build luxury condos. The trust had blocked her at every turn with lawsuits and environmental injunctions. It was her white whale, her ultimate corporate defeat. Forcing her to donate the entire family fortune to the very organization that ruined her prized real estate project was poetic justice. "You malicious little bitch," she spat, her face turning an ugly shade of purple. "I've built this empire alongside him. You cannot give my money to those tree-hugging fanatics." "Therein built the empire," Kalen corrected her, his voice shockingly cold. "You just sat in the big house and complained, and now you get nothing." I opened my laptop again, hovering my cursor over the cancel button for the scheduled email to the district attorney. "You sign the primary authorization forms right now, or I let this timer expire. Choose, Morwenna. Poverty or prison." Sterling practically threw a pen at her. He knew I had him dead to rights on the email metadata alone. His self-preservation instinct overrode his loyalty to her bank account instantly. He shoved the necessary preliminary authorization forms across the glass table. Morwenna stared at the pen like it was a venomous snake. Her entire body shook as she picked it up. She looked at Kalen, expecting some final ounce of filial loyalty to save her, but he just stared back with complete disgust. She slowly pressed the pen to the paper and signed away her houses, her cars, her jewelry, and her massive bank accounts. With every stroke of the pen, she physically deflated. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch vanished, replaced by a broke, terrifyingly ordinary older woman. "It's done," Sterling muttered, rapidly gathering the papers. "I will fast-track the liquidation and the transfer to the trust. Please cancel the email." I clicked the button, disabling the automated send. "I am keeping the flash drive, obviously. If you ever try to contact Kalen or me or our child, I will walk these files into the police precinct myself." Kalen and I walked out of that glass room without looking back. We stepped out of the high-rise building and into the cool afternoon air. For the first time in months, I felt like I could actually breathe. The
the suffocating weight of Morwenna's control evaporated completely. Kalen pulled me into a tight embrace right there on the busy sidewalk, burying his face in my neck. He cried for his father, mourning the horrible reality of his death, but he also held me with a renewed, fierce protectiveness.
We celebrated our small victory that night with cheap takeout in our tiny motel room, but I knew the war was far from over. Getting Morwenna to sign a preliminary authorization under duress was one thing. Actually forcing a massive corporate liquidation would take months of brutal legal wrangling. Sterling promised to fast-track it out of fear, but Morwenna possessed an endless capacity for spite. She would definitely hire new, aggressive defense lawyers the moment we left that room. Sure enough, a thick legal envelope arrived at the motel front desk 3 days later. Morwenna filed an emergency injunction to block the charity transfer, claiming she signed the papers under extreme emotional distress and extortion. She also filed a defamation lawsuit against me, demanding I hand over my falsified hard drives. She wanted a fight. She thought she could outspend us, bleeding us dry in civil court until we gave up and handed over the evidence. Kalen paced the narrow space between the bed and the mini fridge, reading the court summons. "She hired Vanguard and Hayes," he muttered, tossing the paper onto the bed. "They are the most ruthless corporate litigators in the state. We literally have $40 in our checking account, Vesper. We cannot fight them." I picked up the summons, tracing my thumb over the embossed law firm logo. She thought money made her invincible. I smiled grimly. "We don't need money. We have leverage."
I refused to let panic dictate my next move. Vanguard and Hayes built their reputation on intimidating poor people, but they strictly operated within the realm of public perception. High-profile firms despised messy scandals. I needed an ally with deep pockets and a vested interest in destroying Morwenna's empire. I picked up my phone and dialed the main office of the Evergreen Wildlife Trust. A receptionist transferred me to their lead legal counsel, a woman named Kalia, who sounded perpetually exhausted. I introduced myself as Theron's daughter-in-law, and she immediately hung up. I called back. I told her I held legally binding documents transferring my father-in-law's entire estate to her organization. I added that Morwenna currently attempted to block the transfer using illegal injunctions. That kept Kalia on the line. We met at a rundown diner 2 hours later. Kalia arrived wearing hiking boots and a sharp blazer, looking highly skeptical. I slid a sanitized copy of the preliminary authorization forms across the sticky table. She read through the signatures, her eyes widening behind thick tortoiseshell glasses. I explained the situation, omitting the murder evidence but highlighting the forged will and offshore tax evasion. If Evergreen wanted their massive funding, they needed to deploy their own legal team to fight Vanguard and Hayes on our behalf. Kalia stared at me, tapping her fingernails against her coffee mug. She hated Morwenna just as much as I did. Kalia agreed to represent our interests pro bono. Evergreen commanded a massive legal defense fund supplied by wealthy environmentalists, giving us the exact firepower we lacked. Within 24 hours, Kalia filed a massive countersuit against Vanguard and Hayes. She attached the metadata proving Morwenna's intent to hide assets offshore, severely compromising the rival firm's ethical standing. Suddenly, Morwenna's expensive lawyers found themselves defending a client who actively lied to them about international tax evasion. Back at the motel, the stress physically wrecked me. Morning sickness evolved into all-day nausea. Kalen worked double shifts hauling heavy equipment at a local construction site just to pay our weekly room rate. He came home smelling of sweat and cheap diesel, his hands blistered, but his eyes burned with a dark, determined energy. He completely abandoned his geological studies to focus on keeping us alive. Watching him suffer while his mother sat in a mansion fueled a special kind of rage inside my chest. I wanted to accelerate her destruction. Waiting for slow-moving civil courts felt agonizing. I needed to hit her where it truly hurt, her pristine social standing. Morwenna cared about high society status above oxygen itself. I formulated a plan to publicly humiliate her, stripping away her country club friends and her fake philanthropic image. I opened my laptop and started digging into her past charity galas.
Morwenna proudly chaired the annual Crystal Orchid Gala, a disgustingly opulent event raising money for pediatric hospitals. She always bought a table for 10 grand, posing for photographs with local politicians. I sifted through the public tax filings of her personal foundation. The math looked entirely wrong.
She claimed massive deductions for event catering, venue rentals, and floral arrangements. I cross-referenced those claims with the actual vendor she hired. She paid the florist $3,000, but claimed $15,000 on the tax forms. She funneled the excess funds straight back into her personal checking account. She stole from sick children to fund her luxury shoe habit. I printed the financial discrepancies and placed them in a neat little folder. The Crystal Orchid Gala happened to be exactly 3 days away. I needed a way inside the venue. Standard tickets cost $2,000, money Kaylin and I simply did not possess. I called Kalia and asked for a massive favor. The Evergreen Trust frequently sent representatives to these high society events to network with wealthy donors. Kalia laughed out loud when I explained my plan. She messaged me an electronic VIP guest pass 10 minutes later. I dug an old, slightly wrinkled evening gown out of my suitcase. Kaylin ironed it carefully on the motel floor, pressing a soft kiss against my forehead before zipping up the back. The hotel ballroom smelled like expensive champagne and expensive perfume. Waiters circulated with silver trays of tiny appetizers I absolutely could not stomach. I kept to the shadows near the heavy velvet curtains, clutching my small clutch purse tightly. Morwenna held court near the center ice sculpture. She wore a stunning emerald dress, laughing loudly with a state senator and a famous local news anchor. She looked perfectly relaxed, completely confident her expensive lawyers would eventually crush my little rebellion. Her arrogance made my skin crawl. I waited for the main speeches to begin. The event organizer tapped a microphone, calling for silence. Morwenna walked up to the podium, beaming under the bright stage lights. She started reading a scripted speech about generosity and community sacrifice. I practically gagged. I slipped away from the curtains and approached the audiovisual control table near the back wall. A bored teenage technician sat playing a game on his phone. I slid a crisp $50 bill across his soundboard. He looked up, confused. I handed him my encrypted flash drive containing the vendor receipts and the tax filings. I pointed toward the massive projector screen hanging above Morwenna's head. I instructed him to plug it in and hit play on the only video file in the folder. He pocketed the cash, shrugged indifferently, and connected the drive. I stepped back to watch the fireworks.
Morwenna paused her speech to wipe a fake tear from her cheek. Right on cue, the giant projector screen flashed bright white. The soft ambient music cut out entirely. An enormous, high-definition image of her fraudulent tax return appeared on the screen, spanning 20 feet across. The room fell dead silent. The slide quickly transitioned to a side-by-side comparison of the fake $15,000 catering receipt and the real $3,000 vendor invoice. A large red arrow pointed directly to her personal bank routing number. Whispers erupted across the ballroom like a sudden wildfire. Morwenna turned around, her jaw dropping as she read the massive text exposing her embezzlement. The state senator standing nearby visibly took 3 large steps away from her. The news anchor immediately pulled out his phone and started recording the screen. Morwenna panicked. She lunged for the podium microphone, shouting for security to cut the power. Her voice cracked, sounding shrill and utterly unhinged. The bored teenager let the slideshow loop twice before casually yanking the cord from the projector. The damage was permanent. Morwenna grabbed her expensive purse and practically sprinted toward the side exit, pushing past confused donors in a desperate bid to escape the glaring lights. I stood near the exit doors, making sure I caught her eye as she fled. She froze for a split second, recognizing my old dress. I offered her a mockingly sweet wave before disappearing into the crowd.
The fallout hit the local news cycle before sunrise. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, watching the anchor from the gala narrate the scandal over my breakfast of dry toast. Morwenna's face, frozen in a mask of absolute terror, dominated the morning broadcast. They interviewed the event organizer, who confirmed a massive discrepancy in the foundation's accounting. My phone vibrated endlessly. Kalia called to report that Vanguard and Hayes officially dropped Morwenna as a client at 8 in the morning. Law firms that expensive simply do not tolerate public embarrassment, especially when it involves stealing from a children's charity. Kalen sat beside me, sipping cheap coffee from a styrofoam cup. He looked lighter today. The heavy bags under his eyes seemed less pronounced. We watched his mother's pristine reputation burn to ash in real time, and neither of us felt an ounce of guilt.
Without her aggressive legal team, Morwenna stood completely defenseless against the Evergreen Trust's lawsuit. Kalia filed a motion for an emergency asset freeze, citing the clear evidence of embezzlement and flight risk. The judge granted it immediately. Morwenna could no longer access the offshore accounts she tried to hide. She could not sell the luxury cars. She could not even use her credit cards to buy groceries. The walls finally closed in on her entirely. I closed my laptop, feeling a sharp pang of satisfaction. Now, I needed to evict her.
The asset freeze forced Morwenna into a corner she could not buy her way out of. Sterling, her slimy lawyer, stopped returning her phone calls entirely. She became radioactive. Kalia managed to secure a court order validating the preliminary authorization forms Morwenna signed under duress. Kalia argued that the subsequent evidence of her financial crimes made her initial claim of distress completely irrelevant. The judge agreed. Ownership of the entire estate officially transferred to the Evergreen Wildlife Trust. Kalia gave me the absolute honor of delivering the eviction notice. I drove Kaylin's battered sedan up the long gravel driveway of the main estate. The fountain out front sat dry and filled with dead leaves. The landscaping already looked slightly overgrown because Morwenna could no longer pay the gardening staff. I walked up the massive stone steps and hammered my fist against the heavy mahogany door. She answered wearing a stained silk robe, her hair wild and unbrushed. The smell of stale gin practically knocked me backward. She looked 10 years older than she did at the charity gala. When I handed her the official eviction notice, her hands shook violently. She stared at the legal seal, her mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. "You have 24 hours to vacate the premises," I told her, keeping my voice flat and completely devoid of empathy. "The trust takes possession of the property tomorrow morning." She crumpled the paper, throwing it at my chest. "You stole my life," Morwenna screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of her own hysteria. She lunged forward, grabbing the collar of my maternity coat. I shoved her backward hard. She stumbled, hitting the heavy doorframe. I did not feel sorry for her. I remembered the freezing temperatures on the thermostat locks. I remembered Theron suffocating in his sleep while she rested comfortably across the hall. "I took back exactly what you stole from us," I corrected her coldly. "Pack a bag, Morwenna, or the police will physically drag you out tomorrow." I turned my back on her and walked down the steps. I did not run. I took my time, letting my heels click loudly against the stone. I drove back to the motel feeling a massive, suffocating weight lift from my shoulders. The next morning, Kaylee and I parked across the street from the estate gates. We watched a single taxi pull up to the wrought iron entrance. Morwenna emerged from the front door dragging 2 large designer suitcases. She struggled to pull them down the steps herself because the household staff had all quit. She looked pathetic. She looked exactly like a woman who murdered her husband for money and lost absolutely everything. The taxi driver tossed her bags into the trunk without a word. She climbed into the back seat, never looking back at the house. Kaylin reached over and squeezed my hand tightly. We won. Evicting Morwenna satisfied my need for immediate retaliation, but it did not erase the crime she committed against Theron. I still held the flash drive containing the raw medical telemetry data. Sending her into poverty felt like justice for the financial ruin she forced upon us. Sending her to prison felt like justice for Theron. I sat down with Kaylin that evening in our tiny room. We needed to make a final decision together. "I want to send the files to the district attorney," I told him quietly, watching his face for a reaction. He stared at the blank television screen for a long time. The pain of his father's murder still radiated off him in waves. Finally, he nodded. He grabbed his laptop and opened a blank email draft. We attached the smart home logs, the forged signature scans, and the offshore tax documents. Kaylin hit the send button himself. We handed the physical flash drive directly to a police detective the very next morning. The authorities moved incredibly fast. The sheer volume of digital evidence left absolutely zero room for ambiguity or deniability. Within 3 days, the police secured a warrant for Morwenna's arrest. They found her living in a cheap, run-down apartment complex on the industrial side of town. The local news captured the arrest on camera. She tried to hide her face behind a dirty scarf as officers guided her into the back of a squad car.
Kalia invited us to the estate one last time before the Evergreen Trust officially began renovations. They planned to convert the massive mansion into a wildlife rehabilitation center and administrative headquarters.
The irony tasted extremely sweet. Morwena's pristine ballroom would soon house recovering bald eagles and injured foxes. We walked through the empty halls, our footsteps echoing against the bare marble floors. The oppressive atmosphere of the house vanished completely, along with the extravagant furniture. Taryn would absolutely love this outcome. He hated the pretension of this house anyway. He always preferred spending time outside, hiking through the fairy wetlands Morwena tried to destroy for profit. Kaylin stood by the large bay window in Theron's old office, looking out over the sprawling lawn. He rested a hand on my growing stomach, smiling a genuine, warm smile for the first time in months. We gave up a massive financial empire, but we secured something infinitely more valuable. We broke the cycle of greed and cruelty Morwena desperately tried to enforce. We were completely broke, starting over from absolute scratch, but we finally felt safe. The criminal trial loomed on the horizon, promising a long, ugly media circus. We decided we would not attend the hearings. Morwena no longer deserved our time or our emotional energy. We packed Kaylin's sedan with our maker belongings and started driving toward the state line. We needed a fresh start, far away from the shadows of this family.
We settled in a quiet coastal town, 300 miles away from the mess we left behind. We rented a tiny, drafty apartment above a bakery that smelled like yeast and cinnamon every morning. It was a massive downgrade from a sprawling private estate, but I slept sounder on our cheap mattress than I ever did near Morwena. Kaylin found work almost immediately. He joined a small, independent geological survey team mapping out coastal erosion, trading his tailored suits for heavy boots and windbreakers. The physical labor grounded him entirely. The deep, heavy sadness that clouded his eyes slowly started to lift, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. I spent my days setting up the nursery in our second closet-sized bedroom. We painted the walls a soft sage green and bought a second-hand crib from a local flea market. Every time I sanded down a rough edge of the wood, I thought about Theron sketching out nursery ideas. He would have loved this messy, chaotic, deeply normal life. We didn't have millions sitting in an offshore account, but we had enough to buy groceries and keep the lights on. For the first time in my life, that felt like absolute luxury. We were building a home based on mutual respect and actual affection, completely untouched by the toxic, suffocating expectations of high society.
The criminal trial concluded 6 months later, right as I entered my third trimester. We stuck to our promise and refused to attend a single hearing, completely ignoring the relentless voicemails from desperate tabloid journalists. Kalia called me on a rainy Tuesday afternoon to deliver the final verdict. Morwena's public defender completely failed to suppress the digital forensic evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The judge sentenced her to 25 years in federal prison for manslaughter, estate fraud, and grand larceny. She will likely spend the rest of her natural life sitting in a concrete cell. Kalia mentioned that Morwena screamed at the judge during sentencing, blaming me, Kaylin, and even Theron for her downfall. She never showed an ounce of remorse. Hearing the news felt surprisingly anticlimactic. I did not feel a sudden rush of victory or vindication. I just felt incredibly tired. I hung up the phone, walked into the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of cold water. Kaylin wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. I told him the verdict quietly. He simply nodded, kissing my cheek before walking away to finish cooking dinner. We never spoke his mother's name out loud again. The ghost of her tyranny finally dissolved entirely.
Our son was born exactly 1 month after the sentencing. We named him Torian, a nod to Theron's strong, unyielding spirit, hoping he would carry that same light into the world. When the nurse placed him on my chest for the first time, a profound wave of protective clarity washed over me. Looking down at his tiny, wrinkled face, I understood exactly why I fought so viciously against Morwena. I refused to let my child grow up in the shadow of a woman who viewed family members as disposable financial assets. Kaylin cried openly in the delivery room. He held Torian with such overwhelming gentleness, terrified of breaking him. I watched my husband transform into a father right before my eyes. He inherited all of Theron's warmth and absolutely none of his mother's freezing indifference.
We raised Torian in that cramped apartment above the bakery, filling his life with loud laughter, cheap toys, and absolute honesty. We never hid our financial struggles from him as he grew older, but we also made sure he never questioned his worth. He knew he was loved fiercely, unconditionally, and without any bizarre strings attached. We broke the generational curse of the estate, choosing poverty over poison. Every milestone Torian hit felt like a quiet victory against the darkness we barely escaped.
A few years later, a thick envelope arrived in our mailbox bearing the official wax seal of the Evergreen Wildlife Trust. Kalia sent us a beautifully printed quarterly newsletter. The cover photo featured the main facade of the old estate, completely transformed. The oppressive mahogany doors were gone, replaced by welcoming glass panels. The massive manicured lawns where Morwenna used to host her fake charity galas had been allowed to return to their natural wild state, filled with native wildflowers and wandering deer. The main caption read, "The Theron Memorial Sanctuary." Kalia convinced the board to name the entire nature preserve after him. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes as I read the article detailing the sanctuary's work with local schools, teaching kids about environmental conservation. Theron's legacy was not tied up in cold, sterile bank accounts or offshore tax havens. His legacy lived on through the land he loved, protecting the wildlife he always admired. I pinned the newsletter to our kitchen corkboard, right next to Torium's messy crayon drawings. We lost millions of dollars, a sprawling mansion, and a life of absolute ease. But looking at my husband laughing with our son on the living room rug, I knew we won the only prize that actually mattered. We had each other, completely free from deception.
We survived the ultimate betrayal and built something beautiful from the absolute wreckage of Morwenna's greed. That dark chapter of my life is permanently closed, locked away behind the heavy iron gates of a federal prison facility. I finally have peace, and I absolutely never looked back. So that is my entire story. It was a terrifying, deeply exhausting journey, but exposing the brutal truth was the only way to protect my family from a monster wearing a designer suit. Some people might argue that I should have just walked away, ignored the forged will, and left the blood money alone. But letting her get away with murder and theft was never a valid option in my mind. I had to systematically burn her corporate empire to the ground to ensure my child could grow up safely in the light. What do you guys think about all of this? Did my revenge go way too far by forcing her into absolute poverty before sending her to prison? Or was my retaliation entirely justified considering the horrible things she did to Theron? I really want to hear your honest thoughts, so please drop your opinions down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this crazy story, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another dramatic life update. Thanks for watching.